area. And this bend is going to be important because there's a ganglion that's going to sit here for all of the sensory cell bodies of the facial nerve, called the geniculate ganglion. All right, facial nerve will then continue down the posterior side of the middle ear cavity, and it will send two nerve branches into the tympanic cavity, the nerve testopedius and the chorda tympani. We'll come back in a little bit and look at these in more detail. The rest of the facial nerve continues out of the stylomastoid foramen, where it sends out a bunch of different branches, some of which we've already seen. So the ones that head anteriorly are going to go into the parotid gland. Remember, that's the ansa facialis. And then we have a bunch of branches that head posteriorly that are going to innervate our posterior muscles of facial expression, as well as those other muscles that we mentioned. So this posterior belly, the digastric, and the stylohyoid. And then here's our branches to muscles of facial expression. Just real quick, the facial nerve goes straight into the parotid gland, but the facial nerve has absolutely nothing to do with the parotid gland. It doesn't provide any type of innervation to the parotid gland. So there'll be a separate cranial nerve that's in charge of parasympathetics to the parotid. Okay, so this is kind of a review from the superficial face lecture. So these are just the different muscles of facial expression that are innervated by various branches of the facial nerve, and we won't bother going over this again. Okay, so now that we've tracked everything that exits out the stylomastoid foramen, let's go back and look at the branches that go through the tympanic cavity. So here's our schematic tympanic cavity. Here's two of our middle ear ossicles, the incus and the malleus. And remember, the malleus sits right up against the tympanic membrane. And this chorda tympani nerve that passes through the middle ear cavity passes in between the handle of the malleus and the incus. So it passes in between these two middle ear ossicles. When we do our ear dissection, if you get really lucky when you're just kind of smashing away at the ear and it breaks properly, we should be able to see this. So there's this little tiny nerve that passes through in between these two tiny little bones. Here's a little bit more realistic drawing of it. So it passes through a little canal to get into the middle ear cavity, passes between the handle of the malleus and the incus, and then it's just going to continue right on out of the tympanic cavity. So this nerve goes through the tympanic cavity, but again has nothing to do with innervating anything in there. A little bit more of a close-up. So the stapedius muscle is this tiny little muscle in here that sends out a tendon that's attached to the stapes, the third of our middle ear ossicles. And the nerve here is that nerve testopedius. So two nerves go into the middle ear cavity. Only one nerve actually leaves the middle ear cavity. Chorda tympani, as I said, is going to exit back out. And does anyone know what exit it's going to take out of the skull? So we could obviously look at any of the next slides. But this is one of those features of the skull that I'm sure everyone thought was so insignificant that you shouldn't have to learn it. There were a lot of complaints about that on the exam, although we didn't actually pin the one that it comes out of. This is the petrotympanic fissure, so one of those little faint lines that you were meant to find on the temporal bone. So here it was. Here's our petrotympanic fissure. This is the one that we indicated on the exam, the petrosquamous fissure. Right, so after it exits out of the petrotympanic fissure, it's now in the infratemporal fossa. And we have another nerve that you just learned about that sits within the infratemporal fossa, and this is which branch of the trigeminal? V3, right? So that exits through foramen ovale to get into the infratemporal fossa. Our important branch here to note is the lingual nerve, because chorda tympani is going to join up with the lingual nerve and then continue on with the lingual nerve to get to where it needs to go, to a couple of glands and to the tongue. Okay, so fill in those. So below the tongue we have our submandibular gland, and then a little bit farther anteriorly there's the sublingual gland. They are attached here. And we have one of those parasympathetic ganglia sitting down right above the submandibular gland, called the submandibular ganglia. Okay, so now we'll follow our last branch here, this interpetrosal nerve that headed back into the cranial fossa. It's going to pass through the little cartilage plug that sat over top of foramen lacerum. And we said that nothing passes through foramen lacerum, and this isn't actually passing through the foramen itself. It's passing transversely through this plug of cartilage. When we say that nothing passes through it, that doesn't necessarily mean that nothing passes through it. It means nothing of consequence to us passes through it. So there's a series of minor veins that sometimes connect the cranial cavity to veins on the outside of the skull called emissary veins. And in some people, these emissary veins will pass through foramen lacerum. All right, so here's our greater petrosal nerve again. As it passes through the cartilage by foramen lacerum, remember our internal carotid canal passes right through there as well. And running along with our internal carotid is a plexus of nerves, and these are going to be postganglionic sympathetic nerves. So remember, they all synapse in the neck and then follow the internal carotid up into the neck. So at this point, we're going to have a nerve drop off of this plexus on the internal carotid called the deep petrosal nerve, and this is going to be a sympathetic nerve. The deep petrosal will join up with the greater petrosal, and then they'll pass through the pterygoid canal in the sphenoid bone. There's a nice easy name for this, so once they join together, they're called the nerve of the pterygoid canal, and then it passes through the pterygoid canal. In some older textbooks, you'll see this called the Vidian nerve, or the Vidian canal, but they're the same thing. The pterygoid canal, remember, enters into the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa, and sitting in the pterygopalatine fossa is the pterygopalatine ganglia, so another of our parasympathetic ganglia. Also running through the pterygopalatine fossa, we have our second branch of our trigeminal, and then there's a number of named branches that Peter went over on Monday. Our pterygopalatine ganglion is suspended from V2 by some of these connecting branches. Descending from the ganglion, we have greater and lesser palatine nerves. We also have a series of nerves that go into the nasal cavity, so posterior lateral nasals and nasal palatine nerves. So all these nerves we just went over are all branches of V2, not branches of the facial nerve. Coming from the ganglion itself and heading up to the orbit, we have a communicating branch. So remember, the facial nerve is going to innervate the lacrimal gland, which is up in the orbit, but the facial nerve doesn't follow along with V1. It only follows through V2 and then has this branch that heads up to the orbit to get to the lacrimal gland. Also, a more insignificant function, it does provide some parasympathetics to arteries within the eye, but it does that in concert with another parasympathetic nerve that actually goes to the orbit.
Did you say that was the
Well, it's branching from V2. Okay, so now we have the structure of our entire pathway. So now we'll go through and look at which types of fibers or which type of axons we can find within each of these variously named nerves. All right, so we'll start with the easiest one, the somatic motor root. So our somatic motor axons are going to begin in the somatic motor root. Then they'll continue into the facial nerve, wrap around at the genu of the facial nerve. As it approaches the posterior side of the tympanic cavity, it's going to drop off fibers to the stapedius muscle. And then the rest of it's going to continue out the stylomastoid foramen to do all of those branches to muscles of facial expression, as well as the posterior belly of the digastric and the stylohyoid. All right, so that's it for somatic motor. So it starts in the somatic motor root, follows out, and drops off branches at each of the muscles that it's responsible for. All right, so now the parasympathetic pathway. So our preganglionic axons are going to start out in nervus intermedius and head into the facial nerve. At the genu, they're going to split. Some preganglionic parasympathetics are going to head up into the greater petrosal nerve, and some will continue down into the rest of the facial nerve. The parts that continue to the facial nerve are going to enter into the tympanic cavity, into chorda tympani. Chorda tympani then passes through the tympanic cavity, through the infratemporal fossa, and jumps onto the lingual nerve branch of V3 to get down to that submandibular ganglion. The submandibular ganglion is where the cell bodies for the postganglionic parasympathetics are going to lie. And then from that ganglion, to get to the submandibular gland, they'll just go straight down. And then to get to the sublingual gland, it'll jump back onto the lingual nerve to travel to the sublingual gland. Our other parasympathetic pathway up in the greater petrosal, parasympathetics will continue through the pterygoid canal into our other ganglion, the pterygopalatine ganglion, where our postganglionic cell bodies are going to lie. Then from there, it'll travel out to all the different places that it needs to go. So in this case, our parasympathetics that are heading into the nasopharynx are going to be for small mucus glands, and the ones that are going to head up in that communicating branch are going to be for the lacrimal gland and those little tiny arteries in the sclera of the eye. All right. So in green, we're going to show visceral sensory and special sensory. So these are going to start out, in this case, in the tongue here. They're going to follow chorda tympani back, so follow up with the lingual nerve through chorda tympani into the facial nerve. When it gets to the genu, this is where that geniculate ganglion lies. So since these are sensory nerves, their cell bodies have to be outside of the central nervous system, and the geniculate ganglion is the location of these cell bodies. And then from there, our central processes are going to extend up through nervus intermedius into the brain. Okay, we also have visceral sensation and special sensation coming from the palate. So we primarily think of our tongue as our only organ of taste, but you do have very dispersed taste sensation over the palatal mucosa as well. So this is going to be innervated by the facial nerve too. And that's going to follow back along the pathway of the greater petrosal nerve. Also have their cell bodies in the geniculate ganglion, and then the central process will head back through nervus intermedius. All right, and last we'll do our somatic sensory axons. So don't worry about names of any of the somatic nerves. Just know that it's going to provide innervation to this little part of the external ear just outside the meatus. And since it's sensory, they're going to have their cell bodies in the geniculate ganglion, and they also start out life in the nervus intermedius. Okay, was that thoroughly confusing? Okay. So here it is with totally labeled, so you can use this to study from. This is one of those things that I think it's kind of just a brute force learning of where these different branches go and what types of fibers run through them. Some of them are pretty easy, like the somatic motor part will be very easy to remember because it only goes to a couple of places. The rest of it might be a little bit more difficult. But over time, as we go over more and more of these cranial nerves, hopefully some of it will start to sink in. Okay, So we just went over 5 different modalities that run through the facial nerve, and for at least part of this pathway, there's another type of axon that travels through these nerves, so it's not technically a part of the facial nerve, but it does travel with it for a little while. So what fiber type is it? What's our only other fiber type that we didn't cover? Sympathetics, yes. Oops, oh, we didn't know. Okay. So we'll have postganglionic sympathetics will also travel through part. And do you remember which nerves we talked about were sympathetic nerves? Maybe this will help. So where were the sympathetics coming from in the head? Right, so they synapse in the superior cervical ganglion, and then they follow what in the head? The artery. Right, so they follow our internal carotid to get into the head. So this branch that's dropping down off of the internal carotid, the deep petrosal nerve is a postganglionic sympathetic nerve. And then the branches that we talked about, the named branch, our nerve of the pterygoid canal, carries postganglionic sympathetic fibers, in addition to all of the facial nerve fibers.
So is there only one answer to this question?
For which nerves carry it?
Yeah.
Well, so the deep petrosal nerve is one of the nerves. It's not actually part of the facial nerve. That's the connection between the carotid plexus and the branch of the facial nerve. And then the nerve of the pterygoid canal is the named nerve that we talked about that has both facial nerve parts and postganglionic sympathetics. And then I suppose if we were to continue on, those postganglionic sympathetics then travel through all these other branches of the trigeminal, but don't worry about that part. Just know that the nerve of the pterygoid canal carries preganglionic parasympathetics from the facial nerve and postganglionic sympathetics from the sympathetic system. All right, so here's our list of things, again, that the facial nerve has to do, broken down by which of the roots is in charge.